Morning, church. I'll be reading from Mark 14, verses 3 through 9. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.
Glad you guys are here. We are finishing up our Poured Out series today, as Shamus has already said, and hopefully you've enjoyed this series. I've very much enjoyed this series. We've said all along the way, this is a high challenge series. We're extending some lofty challenges, and it ultimately boils down to one challenge, and it's the challenge, the calling, we believe, to go all in on God's kingdom. In fact, we've said this multiple times. A full life, the fullest life possible, is a poured out life. That counterintuitive statement means that we believe our fullest existence is when we are fully poured into the purposes of God, when we fully embraced His kingdom, when we go all in on His kingdom, and we make it our business with all that we are, all that we have, and everything we do to push His kingdom forward. And we've talked about a lot of different aspects of this. As Shama said last week, we talked about generosity, we talked about giving, we talked about money, and as uncomfortable as that topic can often be, it's crucially important to the kingdom of God. It allows us to build trust with the Father. It also allows us tangible opportunities to move the kingdom forward. We had a guest speaker last week. I would affirm what Shaman said. If you didn't hear it last week, I would strongly encourage you to get online and hear it. Chris Marlin from City Church was with us, did an incredible job talking about that topic. He also extended a very practical challenge, called it the Tithe Challenge. Tithe means a tenth. It's the basic idea throughout Scripture that at least 1/10 of everything you've been blessed with should be brought back to God for the purpose of advancing His kingdom. And the Tithe Challenge is a 90-day Tithe Challenge. So if you weren't here last week, you still got 83 days to participate in this. And here's the thing. Here's what Chris said and what Scripture promises. When you do this, it will change you. The participation in this challenge, participation in tithing, working out generosity with God, experiences, this will change things about you. It will change your heart, change your outlook on the world around you. You'll build a deeper sense of trust. It will change you. It'll also change us in a lot of ways. It will give us a tangible and effective means by which we can advance the kingdom. We need this in order for our local body to continue to exist and to continue to chase the calling we believe God has put before us. This is all by God's design, and we get to participate in it. And I'm very, very encouraged and excited to share. Last week, we had 7 families begin giving for the very first time, and that's going to have a tangible impact on the kingdom and the world around us. So I want to encourage you to continue on in that challenge. Excuse me, week before that, we talked about work, how the work that we do contributes to this poured out life. We talked about what it means to use our time, talents, and energy for the purposes of God's kingdom, that everything you do, everything you put your hands to should be a reflection of who you are, but more importantly, who you belong to. And so we are called to work hard. We're called to work diligently. Even though we have earthly bosses, we're called to live and to work as though we are reporting directly to the Lord, which means that all the work we do in a means that brings hope and restoration to the world around us. These are two key factors in a poured out life. But in week 2 of this series, we talked about the key detractor from the poured out life. We talked about sin. And I want to remind us of that, and I want to build on that foundation as we launch into our topic for today. You see, sin is a very, very large and complicated concept, but I want to reduce sin down. I want to talk about what motivates, what initiates sin, and I think it ultimately boils down to one of 3 things: fear, doubt, and pride. See, the serpent, when he came to Adam and Eve, when sin first came into fruition, the serpent did not come, and say, hey, Adam and Eve, you should disobey God. He didn't come and say, hey, you should do the thing he told you not to do. He didn't come and say, hey, you should dabble in sin. What the serpent did is he came in and he asked questions. And those questions, they spawned additional questions. And the more those questions began swirling around in Adam and Eve's heart and mind, the more they lost focus on who they were called to be and what they were called to do. This is what sin does. This is what our enemy does. He often introduces questions that ultimately steal our focus. And I think that's absolutely true when it comes to these 3 things. In fact, I think there's a common question associated with each. When it comes to fear, what if the enemy is stronger than I thought? The enemy interjects this idea. We begin entertaining this idea, and fear grows. When it comes to doubt, what if God is weaker than I thought? What if he can't do the things that he said he can do? What if he won't do the things that he said he can do? When the enemy is able to interject these questions, doubt grows. When it comes to pride, what if I am better off on my own anyway? This is ultimately what he was able to convince Adam and Eve of. God's been holding you back. You could do better on your own. I think this happens to us constantly. This question gets in there, it begins swirling around, and we look at this big mess called sin, and we think, maybe I really can clean it up all by myself. Maybe I don't need anybody's help. Maybe I really can figure this out. And what happens when these questions begin to swirl is it initiates sin's vicious cycle. And it all begins with just simply losing focus. We stop paying attention to the right things because of the distraction of these questions. And the more distracted we become, the more prone we become to wandering. And as we begin to wander, as we begin feeling more disconnected from the source of life, we begin to feel these gaps in our hearts and souls, and we look for things to fill them. We look very, very quickly for things that we can grab a hold to, things that will fill this void. And the problem is they may bring temporary relief, but they ultimately lead to more questions and greater disappointment and greater even emptiness. And so then we just look for more. And more and more and more. And pretty soon it's as if we're in deep, deep water where there is no light. We don't even know which way is up anymore. And we're lost. Now the good news of the gospel is there is a reality that can and will break this cycle. There is a reality that is stronger than the reality of sin. And it's a very, very simple yet profound reality. And it is this, that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord. And this reality, it exists, and we're going to unpack it today on a very, very large scale that encompasses absolutely everything, and on a very, very small scale that is very, very close and very, very intimate. Now, both individually and as a pastor, I have learned firsthand and observed in the life of other people that when it comes to this reality, the large scale and the small scale of Jesus being Lord, the large scale is actually easier for most people to accept. It's actually easier for most people to wrap their heads around. The small scale is far more challenging. You see, on a large scale, what we're saying when we say that Jesus is Lord is ultimately that Jesus is Lord of the whole universe. He is Lord of the whole universe and everything within the universe. And for Jesus to be Lord over the entire universe, it means 3 things. Jesus is in control of absolutely everything. Jesus is in authority over absolutely everything, and Jesus has power over absolutely everything. This means that there is nothing that happens within the universe that catches Jesus off guard. There is nothing that happens in the entire universe in which any force present has a greater say over the immediate situation than Jesus Christ himself, because he's on the throne. And therefore, there is no one that holds more power over what's happening, who can bring more change and restoration than Jesus Christ. He holds all the power. Now, the reality of all this, it can bring an immense amount of comfort. It can also bring an immense amount of tension, especially when we find ourselves navigating life's more difficult and complicated moments. And on the large scale, we obviously have multiple examples of such complications. We have an ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and now we have a brand new war erupting in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas, and the things that are being played out before us, they are both horrifying and gut-wrenching and heart-breaking, and naturally it produces some questions. The entire world is asking why. Why are these things true? Those who at least have somewhat of an understanding of Jesus Christ are asking very specifically, why is this allowed to happen? If Jesus is Lord, then why are these things happening? Now, I think most followers of Christ are asking one of two questions. These are the most common questions I get in moments like this. These are the most common questions I've been getting of late, specifically in regard to what's happening in Israel. And those two questions are simply this. As followers of Christ, what stand should we be taking? And as followers of Christ, what should we do? Now, these questions, they sound similar, but I think they're actually very, very different, so I want to talk about them one at a time. And as I talk about them, I want to offer you a caution when it comes to the former and an encouragement when it comes to the latter. When it comes to what stand we should be taking, I want to offer you a caution. I think we need to be very, very careful as followers of Christ when it comes to taking a stand. Now, to hear me, I did not say Christians should never take a stand. I said we should be very, very careful when it comes to taking a stand. See, as a follower of Christ, the only thing I stand on is the solid foundation of Jesus Christ. And that solid foundation then informs everything I say, everything I do, and even everything I think. This is because I have died to myself and my life is now hidden in Christ. I am learning to walk as he walks. This is the call of the gospel. This means that I look to the example of Christ and I try to allow it to form my response to all of life's complications. Now, some days that's easier than others. We are currently in the midst of a very large complication. And I hear a lot of people, a lot of well-intentioned people, a lot of Christians saying, this is a time for us to take action. And typically, when people call for Christ-like action, what we point to is the time that Jesus flipped over tables and chased people out of the temple courts with a whip, which he did in fact do. There was a moment where Jesus flipped over a bunch of tables, he made a big commotion, caused a big scene, he made a whip, he chased people. It was a pure act of aggression. We've seen it, it happened. I think it's very, very important to note that happened one time. One time Jesus erupted with aggression and took action in the moment. Far more often, as in every single other time, Christ met injustice of any kind. His response and demeanor was very, very different. In fact, sometime later, his brother James, when writing a letter to the church, would unpack this demeanor, and he would actually prescribe it to all believers. We were to adopt it. It says this in James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this," meaning make this a priority. "Everyone, all of us should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." When it comes to any stand, I think we are wise to adopt this demeanor. and to allow the transformation possible within this demeanor to produce and lead to the more important question: what should Christians be doing in the midst of complicated seasons like the one we're in? What Christians should be doing is we should be praying. Now that can sound flippant, that can sound dismissive. We're often accused of that on the national scale, but those of us who know prayer, those of us who have experienced it, know that it is the most powerful weapon in our arsenal. But when we pray, I believe we must maintain the James demeanor of listening more than we talk. In times of chaos and confusion, what we as followers of Christ need the most is to hear from the Lord. And that's what we must discipline ourselves to do. Now, if you are somebody who would like to talk more about what's going on across the world and the significance of various events, we are always happy to engage in such discussions. Every single week, immediately after service, we have pastors available up front, myself included. We would love to talk to you about anything that might be on your mind and any questions you may have. But if you need help with prayer, if you want someone to help you put words to your prayers, if you simply want someone to pray over you, at the close of every one of our services, our prayer team is available up front. We would love the opportunity to do just that, especially now. And so, on a very, very large scale that encompasses absolutely everything in the universe, Jesus is Lord. This means that he has control, he has authority, he has power. But this is also true in the smallest of scales. Meaning, if we were to reduce this reality down as small as possible, it would ultimately mean this: Jesus is the Lord of my heart. That is as near and dear as it gets. Which means that if Jesus is Lord of the entire universe and Jesus is Lord of my heart, he holds the exact same control, authority, and power inside me as he does around me. This means that Christ is not just combating fear, doubt, and pride as it creeps out of the dark, distant corners of the world. Christ is combating fear, doubt, and pride that creep out of the dark corners of my own heart. That's a lot more uncomfortable. And the question becomes, why? Why is Christ putting so much energy into combating these things in my heart? Ultimately, the question is true for the large scale too. Why is Christ going to such lengths to eliminate the presence of fear, doubt, and pride? What is his end game? Is it simply so that the world is a more peaceful place? Is it simply that the world is a better place to live? Is it simply so that I experience more peace and have the opportunity to experience more joy? All of these things are in fact byproducts, but they're not the reason. The reason that Christ has gone to such lengths to establish his control, his authority, and his power over the entire universe, the reason that Christ has fought for your heart, the reason that Christ combats fear, doubt, and pride is to create a space, to create an opportunity for the restoration of the purity of worship. The reason that Christ has done absolutely everything he has done is so that those who come to find life in him might worship him in a style that is unrestricted and unimpeded. It's so that we can worship him real good. That's why Christ does everything he does. And some will say, what a narcissistic quest that Christ is on. Who does this guy think he is? All of this is just so that we can worship him more. He thinks he is the Lord of everything. Because he is. And so the question for us today becomes, if all of this is true, if this is Christ's end game, that the purity of worship can restore, how does pouring ourselves out for the kingdom, if this is our greatest calling, how does doing that somehow purify the worship of Christ in our lives? And to answer that very, very big question, we're going to be looking at this story in Mark chapter 14, the story that you've already heard read. There's this dinner party happening at Simon the leper's house. This woman comes in, she pours out expensive perfume on Jesus. It's this extravagant display of honor. Some people start to grumble amidst and say this is misplaced, it's missed the mark, it's unproductive. Jesus says, nuh-uh, this is really good, this is really, really important. What I want to look at first is how Mark sets the scene for this moment. Mark chapter 14, first 2 verses, Mark says this, "Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away." Why are these festivals significant? They're overlapping festivals. This is where the cross happens. Okay, so what Mark's saying is we're 2 days away from that. We're 2 days away from the moment that all of this is going to come to a head. Notice what he says, "And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming." What are they scheming to do? To arrest Jesus and secretly kill him. This doesn't come as a surprise. We know this happens. We know this has been in the works. But notice what Mark says. "But not during the festival," they said, "or the people may riot." What we see in these first 2 verses of Mark 14 is this growing, palpable sense of urgency. There's urgency on the part of the Jewish officials. They know they have a deadline. They have to hatch their plan. They have to seize and silence Christ before this festival. Because if it happens during the festival, there's going to be too many people. They're going to be too excited about what this guy's talking about and what this guy's doing that it's just going to erupt into a riot. If they wait till after the festival, it's quite possible that at that point he'll just be too powerful to stop. So if they're going to stop him, now is the time. So we have this extreme sense of urgency on the part of the Jewish officials. But we also, on the other side of the coin, feel this extreme sense of urgency on the Christ side of things. Christ knows and has known for some time what is awaiting him in Jerusalem. And it's far bigger than being sold out by the Jewish officials. It's far bigger than false accusations. It's even bigger than the death penalty. Christ knows he's going into a battle that is significantly bigger than anyone could possibly comprehend. He's going into Jerusalem to stand toe-to-toe with the very forces of evil. And he alone must overcome them. He and he alone must conquer the grave, and it's going to cost him everything. Christ knows this is coming. And so he has this incredible sense of anticipation, but at the same time, there's this sense of urgency because he has to prepare his followers. He has to prepare them to encounter one of the most daunting and confusing and gut-wrenching things they're ever going to encounter. And then they somehow got to get their wits about them and get things back in order so that they can carry on the calling that erupts from this. They're going to establish his church. His church that he's already told them that the gates of hell will not even be able to shake. So much significant stuff is about to happen, and all of it is 48 hours away. There's an extreme sense of urgency. And in this collision of all this urgency results an imperative question that ultimately everyone at this dinner party will have to answer. And it's ultimately a question we all have to answer. Are you with Christ or are you against him? To put it another way, to whom will your allegiance, attention, and devotion belong? Another way of saying this is, who will you worship? I think what is so important about the established sense of urgency that Mark leads into this story with is that it juxtaposes this question into imperative extremes. Meaning there's no middle ground. You are either with Christ from this moment on or you're not. Because there's no halfway. You can't live with a foot in both ponds because these movements are moving in two opposite directions. And so it's almost as if Christ is establishing at this dinner party, are you moving forward with me? Or are you moving away from me? And it's in the midst of all this urgency and the tension that this urgency is breeding that this extravagant display of honor takes place. And Mark notes a few little details that are very, very significant. Number one, this perfume that this woman is pouring out on Jesus, it's being presented in a very, very expensive and extravagant jar. It's an alabaster jar. These were typically, very, very revered. They were typically very ornate, like well decorated. It would have looked good, like this was a significant jar. You didn't just put anything in this. And then Mark clears it up why such an extravagant jar is being used, because inside is choice perfume. I mean, it's pure nard. It's as pure as it gets. This would have been very, very expensive perfume. Mark later notes that this would have cost a year's wages. Imagine that, saving up everything you make for an entire year and spending all of it on one jar of perfume. That's some serious perfume. And so we know, like, this is unbelievably expensive, this whole situation. It's literally irreplaceable. And then we get the very, very significant note that as this woman is pouring out this very expensive perfume from this very nice jar, she breaks the jar. And this does not happen by accident. She intentionally does this. And the question becomes why? Well, there's actually a lot of cultural significance here. Okay, see, typically a situation like this would play out when you invited someone over for dinner. And most typically it would play out when you invited someone over for dinner and you served them wine. Wine was very, very significant in Jewish culture. In fact, in the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, it's used nearly 66 different times to convey the same idea about God's kingdom, that it is filled with peace. Wine became representative of peace. When you invited someone in your home and you served them wine, you were inviting them into a moment of enjoying the peace of God's kingdom. You were saying, I want the peace of the Lord to exist between us. Now here was a way that you could really turn things up. When you invited someone over and you planned to serve them wine, you would go and you would pick out your nicest glass, the glass you hold in highest regard, and you would give them that glass and you would fill it up. And when you're done drinking wine and everybody's had their fill and they're all finished and their glass is empty, you'd take that glass and you would break it. And this wasn't your way of saying, hey, night's over, you need to head home. Like, this is so much bigger than that. This was you declaring to your guest, I cannot fathom that there will be another person to come into my home that I could offer this glass to that would be more worthy of honor than you. I hold you in such high regard that I'm literally going to retire that glass so that nobody else ever drinks from it again. That is how much honor I want to show you. And this is exactly what this woman is doing. She has taken something that is absolutely invaluable to her, a year's worth of wages. And what's more is she has put it into a jar that itself is extremely valuable. And she completely pours out the former and then breaks the latter in an extreme display, extravagant display of honor to say, there is no more honor I could possibly muster. But Jesus, you deserve it all. And then this moment is escalated by some grumblers. Now, Mark notes that not everybody is grumbling. There's just a few people that begin whispering to each other. And ultimately what they're whispering is that this act of honor, though valuable and Christ absolutely deserves it, it's missed the mark. And ultimately what they're saying, they're not saying Jesus should not be honored. They're not saying that he should not be shown high reverence and respect. They're not questioning that at all. Sometimes this passage gets manipulated that way. That's not the case at all. Everybody in the presence of this meal is very much affirming Christ deserves this honor. What they are saying is that he would have been more honored if the outpouring, if the gift had been more productive. And they're whispering to each other, what she should have done. She should have sold that perfume. If she was going to break the jar anyway, she should have sold it. She could have taken those proceeds. She could have helped the poor. That would have brought way more honor to Christ than what she did. Now imagine for a moment this woman. Okay, you have taken something that is truly priceless in a truly priceless container. This probably accounts for virtually everything you have And you have poured it out. You have broken the jar. There's no taking this back. And then you hear the whispering that you've missed the mark, that your gift has fallen short. Imagine the opportunity that fear and doubt and pride would have had in this woman's heart. But before the woman could be gripped by the vicious fangs of the sin cycle, Christ speaks up, and he has a perspective that no one in attendance was expecting. A perspective that none of them had anticipated. Notice what he says in verse 6 of Mark 14. He says, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? Another way of translating that would be, why are you bogging her down with worry? She has done a beautiful thing. So Christ takes their concerns, their accusations, and he turns it around and he says, what's actually happening hasn't missed the mark at all. There's no peeling back the curtain on this moment. What you've seen before you, it actually is a very, very beautiful thing, a significant thing. What has happened here is so significant, in fact, that we would be making an absolute mistake if we missed its profound beauty. Notice what he says in verse 7. The poor you will always have with you. You can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. In one verse, Christ says two very, very difficult and confusing things. The first is this thing about the poor. It almost sounds flippant. It almost sounds as if Christ is like, listen, guys, quit complaining. You can help the poor anytime because there's lots of them. So many poor people, you can find them on every corner. Me, I deserve this perfume. It feels problematic. What Christ is actually saying is he's actually referencing the Old Testament. Very, very specifically, he's referencing Deuteronomy 15. Which is a very, very significant passage because in this passage, God is preparing his people to live in a very particular place, the promised land. And this land has been promised because God has made a covenant with his people. He has initiated this covenant. This covenant is going to establish that he will be their God. They get to be his people. And immediately after establishing this covenant, God gave them these commands, the 10 commandments that began informing them who they are called to be, how they are called to live. And then he begins preparing them to live in a very particular place. And when they live there, this relationship is going to be fully engaged. He's God. They're his people. They're living in constant connection, constant communion, meaning everything they are flows out of their relationship with him. What are we describing? We're describing worship. God is saying, I'm creating a place where you can live in full worship of me. And the more you worship me, the more life I infuse in you, and you live as my people. And so one of the many things they were called to do as God's people in Deuteronomy 15 was take care of poor people. And what God literally says to him is, you're going to have ample opportunity to do this. I'm going to constantly be putting people in your path that you get to show grace and honor to, that you get to take care of. But as you take care of them, do not forget who you are. Do not forget what infuses the life in you necessary that you might extend it to someone else. Deuteronomy 15 is a great passage on benevolence. It's also a reminder that our benevolent lifestyle to which we're called to is completely fueled by worship. That's exactly what Christ is saying. Christ is saying, hey guys, I know you want to be productive. I know you want to get out there and you want to change the whole world. And that's super, super important. It's a noble cause, but you will fall on your faces if you miss this moment. What's happening in your midst, it's going to fuel all of that. And you're going to have ample opportunity, but you cannot miss this. And then he says something even more problematic. He says, and you will not always have me. You'll have lots of poor people, but you won't always have me. Now, this is less problematic for us because we're reading this passage with a bigger context. We know what happens in 48 hours, okay? We've already seen it. We've already experienced it. We know what happens shortly after that. We know that Christ doesn't stay dead. He raises again. Like, we know everything that comes out of the beauty that began as chaos on the cross. But the people at this dinner party, they have no idea. Okay, Jesus has been trying to prepare them for this reality for some time. And every time he does, they just kind of lose their minds. Like he'll sit his disciples down and go, hey, so one day I'm going to be betrayed. No, not a chance. We would never do that. Yeah, but one of you will. No. And listen, when I'm betrayed, I'm going to be handed over. Nope, not a chance. We'd protect you. No, you won't be able to. Like, it's going to happen. Like, I'm going to. No. One day I must suffer. Not a chance. Don't say that, Jesus. It drove him crazy. And so Jesus tenderly, he's preparing them for this again and again and again. But at this point, they simply don't get it. But in 48 hours, they will. And they're going to lose their minds for a little while. And they're going to run, and they're going to scatter, and they're going to hide. But pretty soon, they're going to get their wits about them. And when they get their wits about them, they're going to think back on all the things that Christ was preparing them for. And so Christ said a lot of things before the cross that didn't make sense till after the cross, and this is absolutely one of them. Notice what he says in verses 8 and 9. She did what she could. He's still talking about the woman. Better translation would be she gave what she had. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Again, they don't understand this. But then he says this, truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her, wherever the gospel is preached. So what is the gospel? The gospel is that God loved the world so much that he gave. What does it mean to give his only son? His son died on a cross. And he rose again. And it gave the opportunity for life to anyone who would call upon him, anyone who would give him access to their hearts. That's the gospel. But the people sitting at this dinner party, they don't know what the gospel is yet. So how can they even begin to fathom what it would look like for it to be preached anywhere? Why is Christ saying all of this right now? Because he knows that they're going to lose their minds, and then they're going to start to get their wits about them, and then they're going to start connecting some dots, and he wants this to be one of those dots. When they experience what the gospel is, when they see with clarity what Christ is doing, what he's done, what he was always working towards, he wants them to think about this moment and realize what it really means. And let's make this very, very simple. The most appropriate response to the extravagant grace extended to you through the gospel is to completely pour yourself out in worship of Christ our Lord. That may feel too simple. That the only thing Christ wants in response to everything he has done is first and foremost that my heart would fully engage in worship. It may feel too small, but consider this. One time, Christ flipped over some tables. And he chased people out of the temple courts with a whip. Do you know why he did that one time? Because he walked into the temple courts, and what was playing out before him was a scene in which worship in its purity was being restricted and impeded. And Christ said, I will not stand for this. The only act of aggression that we see on the part of Christ in all of the Gospels, the moment where he became enraged and he acted on that rage in holy anger, the moment that he flipped tables, the moment that he chased people with a whip, what was Christ fighting for? Your worship. And that it might have the opportunity to be pure and unimpeded. That's what Christ fights for most adamantly. And the reason he fights for it, the reason he would go to the lengths he would go to establish the opportunity for your worship to be pure is because there is so much at stake. And what's at stake? Keep reading. Very next verses, Mark 14, 10 and 11. Then Judas Iscariot. This comes right out of this moment, okay? We are still at dinner, and then suddenly Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, leaves dinner, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. Straight out of this moment, this extravagant display of honor and worship in which Christ says, when all heck breaks loose pretty soon and you lose your minds and then you see what I've done, think about this moment. This must be your priority. Judas stands up from that and he beelines it to the Jewish officials, and they were delighted to hear this. Why? Because their urgency has been appeased. And promised to give him money. It's a heavy moment. And obviously, Scripture doesn't say this. But it's a moment in which, if we believe the extremes have been established, you're either with Christ or you're not. You either worship him or you don't. It's almost as if Judas makes his way to the chief priests and they take that bag of money and they go, here you go, Judas. Here's your new king. Here's the new Lord of your life. And then Judas would go on, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. And a little over 48 hours later, it would come. This is what's at stake. This is at stake because there is no halfway. There is no middle ground. Your heart either belongs to Christ as Lord of everything, or you will give that lordship to something else. You will give up that control. You will give away the authority. You will give away the power. You will give your worship to something else if it doesn't belong to Jesus. The simple reality is that your worship defines who your heart belongs to. And here's the deal. Your worship is defined by what you pay attention to. It's defined by what you are most devoted to. Worship never, ever happens by accident. It's defined by what you give the most of yourself to. And so I want to ask you some questions that you can ask yourself. And it's simply this: what are you devoted to? What's your highest priority? Not the answer that you give to other people, but in your heart of hearts, what do you hold in highest regard? What are you giving yourself to? Who or what is being given control in your life? Who is being given the authority to speak direction and purpose into your life? Who is being given the power to influence and direct your steps? Who is the Lord of your life? There is no middle ground. If Christ is on the throne, if that is your sincere desire and you are ready to do what it takes to ensure that he is Lord of your life, the only appropriate response to Christ's lordship is full and complete, poured out worship. This means that everything you are, everything you have, everything you do is now leveraged for him and his kingdom. You yourself are like an alabaster jar that has been broken off from every other purpose. You hold one purpose, and it is to be poured out day by day for Christ, who is your Lord, who is your hope, and who is your life. Let me pray for us. Father God, Lord, we don't say any of that lightly. So Lord, give us a moment, just one moment of calm, where we take a deep breath. Lord, may we acknowledge the weights of those words. Lord, may we acknowledge the weights of the statement that Jesus is Lord. May we acknowledge the grand scale of that reality that Jesus is Lord of the entire universe, which means he has all control, he has all authority, he has all power. And then may we encounter the reality that Jesus desires above all that to be the Lord of my individual heart, which requires me to give up all control, to give over all authority, to let go of all the power. But Lord, maybe most importantly, as only you can, do a work in my heart, do a work in our hearts that reveals to us that we were never capable of such control. We were never capable or could carry such authority. We cannot wield such power. Lord, our lives are best lived, are best experienced, will tell the greatest story if they are firmly within the care of your hands. And Jesus Christ who is Lord, has made a way for that. But that way only goes through him. It only goes if I come and die and experience the life that only he can bring. And so, Lord, I pray in these moments we would encounter that reality, Father God, and you would give us the boldness, the courage to make a decision about Jesus Christ. And Lord, I pray humbly that decision would be to give him complete control, complete authority, and complete power of our lives. And then may we live boldly, courageously, and intentionally for your glory, for your renown, for your kingdom. It's in Jesus' name that I ask all of this. Amen.